Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about another movie that makes me never want to step foot on an airplane ever again. On a Wing and a Prayer through Amazon Studios, just released. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So the movie On a Wing and a Prayer is based on a true story on Easter Sunday 2009, I believe, of a man named Doug White and his family who were traveling on a private airplane when suddenly the pilot drops dead, stuck 17,000 or so feet in the air, no real flight experience as a pilot. And suddenly, through the help of people at the airlines and on the ground, and through a lot of fervent prayer, they must land this airplane. And it's an inspirational kind of a faith-based story. And I'll say this about the film kind of overall, and then we'll break it down into some of these elements, is that as a film, it is not always smooth flying. There is sort of some clunky message-driven dialogue, and I think maybe at times there's not a clear identity of what kind of film it wants to be. But that being said, kind of much like Mr. Doug White on that airplane, kind of as this film goes on, it eventually does find its way, kind of find its bearings a little bit. And I do think ultimately leads to a satisfying kind of emotional kind of ending that did kind of win me over by the end of this. I did enjoy this film, although I had some issues along the flight. But why don't we jump into this? So the movie is led kind of by some recognizable names, primarily Mr. Dennis Quaid, as well as Heather Graham. Quaid plays the man Doug White, and then Heather Graham plays his wife, and they're kind of joined by kind of a cast of this talented actors and actresses. A lot of people that you might recognize from being in various other stories and movies, even if you can't necessarily remember exactly their name or what stories those were in. But really, everyone does well acting-wise in this. Even the cast, sort of the youngest members. You have a kind of a young 13-year-old flight enthusiast, and then her buddy that's on the ground, and they're sort of tracking the progress of this. And they kind of end up being one of the best parts of this movie. They are a delight. They kind of add a little bit of sort of that. Although they're not even all that related to what's going on in the plot, they kind of provide like the audience view into the thing, and they're charming, they're enjoyable. So I think sometimes again, I'm guilty of this opinion as well. But sometimes sort of faith-based content and stories have a bit of a stink to them. You gotta plug your nose. This movie isn't necessarily that. Kind of from the acting to the cinematography to sort of the construction of this movie, really nothing is done. This is not amateur hour at all. This is all competently done. And I think that the film is definitely at its best when it just allows sort of that real life dramatic tension to unfold, both sort of in the sky on the airplane and then also on the ground. Because things kind of go awry for the White family on their flight about 32 minutes into the runtime of this movie, which leaves about a full hour for the we need to land this airplane drama, which ironically is I think about twice as long as the real life flight total took. And it's a tall task. It's even kind of our other plane and crisis movie of the year, Gerard Butler's aptly titled Plane, which came out in January. Even that movie really only devoted like about 15 minutes to the actual plane crash, and then the rest of it happened on an island, because it's a lot to maintain tension kind of on a simple premise of a plane stranded in the air trying to land it for a full hour. But I'll say that this movie, it succeeds. It does. I think because of some of the with the director and sort of allowing some of the ebbs and flows of the story and kind of shifting the perspective and kind of adding new elements to the sort of crisis story, that it manages to keep tension throughout this film. That kind of once it gets going, I did find myself sort of leaning forward on the edge of my seat, invested in the moment. And even the end of this movie, I won't spoil how it ends, although it is, as you might guess, a somewhat happy ending. But I was legitimately somewhat emotional at the end of this, which is not always the case, kind of callous, grumpy person that I am. But I think it is a testament to the ability of the filmmakers to get you invested in the tension of this crisis and in the characters and kind of wanting them to succeed and sort of cheering them on. Unfortunately, where this film begins to hit a little bit of turbulence along the way is definitely in the writing, and particularly in sort of the faith-based elements of the writing. Because this film, like several other kind of faith-based films, it does fall into the trap of sort of having characters say things to each other, but really they're saying it to the audience. And it comes across a little more like the script writer trying to communicate sort of these teaching moments rather than an authentic moment that these real life characters would have. Because there's several scenes that definitely fall into this. There's one scene between Quaid and Graham, kind of where Dennis Quaid's character Doug is beginning to sort of question his faith a bit because of a tragedy. And just sort of, where is God after all? Maybe the things I believed weren't true after all. And she's sort of, trying to encourage him that God is real and God won't leave you. And again, the message itself is a good, wholesome, biblical message. It's a message I think people need to hear. But the actual scene itself is quite cringy and just sort of forced, where it does break the immersion of, okay, this is not a story anymore. This is more of like a teaching Bible study moment. And kind of further from that, this film doesn't always seem to sort of trust sort of the power of the story itself, that there is sort of this inspirational story of faith that's this, inherent to the story and what happened, where it does sort of try and kind of over-explain it. There's a scene where someone's on a phone and they're talking to Doug, trying to help him land kind of near the end of this film and trying to encourage him. And the quote that this character says, "I know you don't know me, you can't see me, but I'm here to help you. Believe in me. Sometimes you've got to trust in things you can't see." And it's just moments like that are just such a heavy-handed, kind of forced metaphor to sort of teach this moment, and especially coming from a character which by all accounts in the film itself would never say something like that, that it does sort of seem like this is a moment where the scriptwriter and the writing is trying to get audiences to make sure they get the metaphor of sort of this faith thing, rather than just sort of trusting the story that it itself is inspirational. Maybe the other area where things get at least slightly bumpy is just sort of in the identity. This film kind of tries to chart a path between being a slightly more kind of gritty story while also remaining a very widely accessible traditional faith-based story. So you get elements like characters speak minor profanities throughout. Nothing. This isn't Father Stew. It's not like heavy profanity or anything, but more than you would typically get in a faith-based film, where else characters kind of more openly talk about sex or sexual things. But yeah, even the sexual stuff is largely treated like in the context of a marriage, or else kind of treated as like a sinful kind of womanizing thing. Again, personally, maybe this will be a matter of taste. I don't necessarily have a problem with either of those elements in a faith-based story. I just felt like in a film like this that is otherwise very much sort of a traditional sanitized faith-based film, rather than feeling kind of authentic, they came across a bit more desperate, sort of like a way to try and show that this isn't just your grandpa's faith-based film. This is a more edgy, real film, which again, I thought didn't fit well with the story that they were telling. As far as content, to consider things going on of the surface of this film, language, like I said, just a mindful of sort of profanities, maybe 3 or 4 kind of more minor profanities, and a character that is in peril kind of utters "oh my God" multiple times on the airplane. So again, not a whole lot, although maybe more, less than 0, which is notable for a more faith-based film. Sexuality, again, kind of a married couple flirts and kind of talks about their intentions of having of sex later that night. In another scene, a woman at the bar tells a man, I like to get inside a man's head before he tries to get me inside of his bed. And then later at work, that man is talking to a coworker and implies that he succeeded in getting her into his bed, and that he doesn't know her name, but all he knows is she loves bourbon and lots of it. So again, you don't see like skin, nothing sexual in that way, although there is sort of more open talk about sex. Violence, there's no violence. Obviously, the pilot dies. There's some death in this, but nothing violent. And maybe this the other thing is just alcohol. Again, alcohol can sometimes be just sort of used in these sort of films as like shorthand for this character's not a believer, and he's sort of rough around the edges, and that's kind of how it's used in this film, where there are scenes at the bar and characters talk often about different alcohol or drinking or having a hangover, although it's very much sort of it's not something that's like endorsed throughout the film, but there's that is there that as well. As far as themes, kind of things going on beneath the surface of this film, maybe a couple things. I think maybe the main one is what I would say is faith in the unseen. I think airplanes have always sort of kind of long been a metaphor for pastors to use to illustrate faith and belief. The fact that average dummies like me don't understand the laws of aerodynamics, and we don't know the name of the pilot. We just hear his voice and we trust that he knows what he's doing. And so it's always sort of been this metaphor for hey, we all exercise faith in our daily life. Even those that don't necessarily profess to know. To know God. And so On a Wing and a Prayer kind of builds on that classic metaphor of hey, trusting in what you can't see. Obviously, the quote that I mentioned earlier, as far as kind of on the nose with that, as far as sometimes you got to believe in things you can't see, kind of metaphorically, kind of alluding to God. And there's sort of all throughout. There's other sort of instances or references. One of the young flight enthusiast, kind of funny, humorously declares to her mother, she says, "Since I've turned 13, I don't believe in things I don't see. That includes the Easter Bunny, the Boogeyman, and Dad." And her dad, sort of in the story, he's apparently a workaholic, although it seems like he's a good dude overall, and he does make his appearance known, much like God does in this film. So there sort of is that more surface level of sort of believe in God, even though we can't see God, and how the flight is sort of a metaphor for that. Maybe on a deeper level, where this film has a bit more nuance to that, is sort of treating the unseen nature of God, not just in the fact that God's invisible, but just that we can't recognize or we don't understand. He's more incomprehensible. And that is sort of Doug's journey throughout this film, is that he kind of at the start of the film, there's a personal tragedy that really shakes his faith. Kind of has him in that conversation with Heather Graham's character, his wife, kind of questioning, I've always believed, but I just don't see I don't see God. One of his quotes in that conversation says, "Why would he meaning God, why would he let this happen? I've always been a believer, but this is a kind of test, or maybe all the stuff they told me in church just doesn't mean what I thought it did." So very much sort of wrestling with that classical philosophical problem of suffering and pain, of, even if you sort of believe in theory of God, what do you do when you just don't see his presence in the world? So that is sort of a theme that goes all throughout this. And maybe a second theme, another kind of thing that this film sort of comes out in the story, is just that God works in mysterious ways. And this movie kind of swaps between quite a few different perspectives of there's sort of these like sub stories that are going on that all sort of relate to the main story of the plane needing to land, although their stories don't necessarily connect with each other, just sort of different vantage points of the action. And I'll admit, at first, I wasn't totally sold on that approach. It kind of seemed like maybe they're just padding the runtime, because again, they got to stretch a 20-minute flight into this hour and 40 or so minute movie. But I think what becomes effective in that approach is just showing the different ways that kind of God is working throughout this whole process. Obviously in the kind of Christian characters and the characters that are literally bowing and praying. But I think maybe even more interesting is how God kind of works in the characters that you wouldn't necessarily assume that God would work through. I'll admit that when sort of some of the non-Christian characters in this film were introduced, I kind of groaned because they largely sort of fell into that trap of like, everyone that's not a Christian in this movie is like just sort of has a big temper, or they're an alcoholic, or they speak rudely to their wife, or some combination of all three of those, and very much a non-nuanced depiction of these sort of atheist or at least agnostic kind of characters. But the film does ultimately sort of give them more of a heroic role. I think even more than a lot of these types of films tend to do, where those characters do sort of end up playing a role kind of in God's plan to help land this plane. And so I do think that another kind of theme that comes out is just the fact that God works can work through anyone he chooses to accomplish sort of his divine will. So in the end, On a Wing and a Prayer kind of won me over. I don't necessarily think this is, one of my favorite movies I've seen lately. I think there is some sort of bumpy elements to it. But overall, I think it is a good story. And this is a movie I think that lots of Christians will enjoy. It's an exciting story. It's not a boring film by any means. And it does have sort of this a very positive message of faith, which I found which I found refreshing. I do think some of the stiff writing and kind of the preachy dialogue does keep it from soaring quite as high as it had the potential to with sort of the source material. But at the end, this is very much a captivating drama with a lot of tension and a very positive message of faith. But hey, let me know. This thing's on Amazon Prime Video, so a lot of you probably already have access to it. Don't need to pay to go to the theater. So encourage you guys, check this movie out. Let me know what you thought. Jump in the comment sections. Let me know if you enjoyed the film, if you didn't enjoy the film. And if, like me, you just hope you never have to fly on an airplane for a very long time ever again. But hey, guys, I want to thank you guys for watching. Encourage you, if you haven't done so, subscribe to our channel, become a Collider, and sort of join with what we're doing here with our reviews and live streams and other stuff. But thanks for watching, guys. Stay safe and continue to collide through a world for Christ.